Patricia called Dr. Yamamoto 3 weeks after taking the hummingbird chicks. The news wasn't what anyone had hoped for initially, but it was better than expected. One of the chicks hadn't made it through the first 48 hours. Its metabolism had been too weak, and despite Patricia's expert care, it simply couldn't survive without its mother. But the other 2 chicks, the ones Patricia had said showed real strength, were thriving. They were eating every 20 minutes like clockwork. Their eyes had opened. Tiny feathers were starting to replace the soft down on their bodies. They were going to make it. They're fighters, Patricia told Dr. Yamamoto over the phone, especially the female. She's got this personality already. Demanding, feisty, just like a proper hummingbird should be. Margaret cried when she heard the news, both tears of sadness for the one they lost and tears of joy for the 2 survivors. She'd been following their progress obsessively, calling the rehabilitation center so often that Patricia had started sending her daily video updates. Dr. Yamamoto, meanwhile, was deep in the process of documenting everything they'd learned. The paper she was writing had grown from a simple observation report into a comprehensive analysis of what they were calling inadvertent chemical mimicry combined with thermal mutualism. The term sounded complicated, but the concept was elegant. A bird had accidentally discovered that certain plant combinations could fool wasps into thinking there was no threat, and that her own body heat could keep the wasps alive longer, which in turn protected her nest from other predators. The scientific community's reaction to her preliminary findings was mixed. Some researchers were fascinated. Others were skeptical. Dr. Richard Chen supported her work completely, adding his own analysis of the chemical compounds. Other entomologists wanted more proof, more examples, more data, but the evidence was solid. The chemical analysis didn't lie. The thermal imaging was clear. The wasp's behavior was documented on video. And most importantly, the nest existed. They had the physical evidence preserved in the lab, where other scientists could examine it themselves. Dr. Yamamoto spent 6 weeks preparing her paper for submission to Nature Communications, one of the most respected scientific journals in the world. Every claim needed to be backed by data. Every conclusion needed to be logical and defensible. She worked with statisticians to analyze the probability of this happening by pure chance. The numbers suggested that while rare, it wasn't impossible. Given the right circumstances, the right materials, and a smart enough bird, this could happen. The question that fascinated everyone was whether this would happen again. Had happened before. Could be replicated. Dr. Yamamoto included in her paper a call for other researchers to look for similar examples. She suspected this wasn't as unique as it appeared. Nature was creative. If one hummingbird figured this out, others might have too. The journal accepted her paper after 3 rounds of peer review. Other scientists had questioned her methods, asked for additional tests, and demanded clarification on certain points. She'd answered every question thoroughly. When the acceptance email came, she sat at her desk and cried with relief. Margaret's shed had become something of a local landmark. Word had spread through the small Oregon town about the incredible nest discovery. People drove by slowly, hoping to catch a glimpse of something unusual. Margaret, who'd always been a private person, found herself giving interviews to local newspapers and even a regional television station. "I just heard a sound," she told the reporters. "I didn't do anything special. I just paid attention." But Dr. Yamamoto knew better. Margaret's quick thinking and willingness to call for help had made this discovery possible. A less curious person might have just knocked down the nest and never known what was inside. Margaret had trusted her instincts that something unusual was happening, and that trust had led to a scientific breakthrough. 6 weeks after the chicks were taken to rehabilitation, Patricia called with the news everyone had been waiting for. The 2 surviving chicks were ready to be released. They'd grown strong. They could fly. They could feed themselves. They had every skill they needed to survive in the wild. Would Margaret want them released on her property? Patricia asked. It's where they hatched. It might be a good place for them to start their lives. Margaret said yes immediately. She cleared her schedule. She told Dr. Yamamoto and her team, everyone wanted to be there for this moment. On a warm afternoon in early December, an unusual group gathered in Margaret's backyard. Patricia was there with the 2 young hummingbirds in a special carrier. Dr. Yamamoto and her team came with cameras to document everything. David, the pest control specialist who'd started this whole journey, took time off work to attend. Even Betty, Margaret's neighbor, stood on the edge of the property watching. The two hummingbirds were beautiful. Their green feathers caught the sunlight. Their wings moved so fast they were just blurs. They perched on Patricia's fingers, looking around at the world they'd never truly seen before. This was their first real experience of freedom. Patricia opened her hands. For a moment, the birds just sat there, taking everything in. Then the female, the feisty one, launched herself into the air. Her brother followed a second later. They flew in circles around the garden, testing their wings, exploring their new territory. Margaret had filled her feeders with fresh sugar water that morning. It didn't take long for the young hummingbirds to find them. They hovered at the feeders, drinking deeply, their tiny tongues working like pistons. Everyone watching held their breath, afraid to disturb this perfect moment. Then something remarkable happened. The female hummingbird flew to the shed. She hovered near the entrance, chirping softly. She flew inside for a moment, then came back out. She flew around the shed 3 times as if she was remembering something, or maybe looking for something. "She's looking for her mother," Patricia said quietly. "Or the nest," she remembers. The male joined his sister, and they both explored the shed area thoroughly, but there was nothing there to find. The nest was long gone, preserved in a laboratory. Their mother had disappeared, probably finding a new territory after her nest was disturbed. These two young birds were on their own now, but they weren't entirely alone. Margaret had promised to keep her feeders full. She'd watch over them as long as they stayed in the area, and to everyone's surprise, they did stay. Throughout the winter, both hummingbirds made Margaret's garden their territory. They chased away other hummingbirds who tried to use the feeders. They built their own small nests in the trees, separate from each other as hummingbirds naturally did once they matured. And here's where the story took another interesting turn. The female hummingbird in her second year built her nest in a spot that made Dr. Yamamoto's phone ring immediately when Margaret noticed it. The bird had chosen a location right next to a small paper wasp nest that was just beginning to form under Margaret's porch eaves. "She's doing it again," Margaret said on the phone, her voice filled with wonder. "Or at least she's near the wasps. On purpose." Dr. Yamamoto drove out to see it herself. The hummingbird's nest wasn't inside the wasp nest this time, but it was close. Within 2 feet, close enough that the wasps would normally be a threat, but they weren't bothering the bird at all. And when Dr. Yamamoto examined the materials the hummingbird had used to build her nest, she found the same types of plants her mother had used, the same spider silk, the same specific combination. She learned it, Dr. Yamamoto said with absolute certainty. Before her eyes even opened, before she could fly, she was imprinted with the smell of those materials. She knows somehow that these plants make her safe near wasps. It was inherited knowledge passed from mother to daughter through exposure, and possibly genetics. The young bird didn't understand why these materials worked, but she knew they did, and she was using that knowledge to her advantage. Dr. Yamamoto's paper was published in Nature Communications that spring. The response from the scientific community was overwhelming. Researchers around the world started looking for similar examples. Within 6 months, 3 other cases were documented of birds nesting unusually close to wasp or hornet colonies. None were as dramatic as the original discovery, but they suggested that this behavior might be more common than anyone had realized. The paper got picked up by popular science magazines, then news websites, then social media. Margaret's simple video of a chirping wasp nest went viral, viewed millions of times. People were fascinated by the story of the brave mother hummingbird, who'd figured out how to live alongside her enemies. Schools started using the story in science classes. It became an example of animal intelligence, adaptation, and the surprising ways nature finds to survive. Children wrote letters to Margaret asking about the birds. Some wanted to become scientists because of this story. Others just wanted to know that the hummingbirds were okay. Margaret framed some of those letters and hung them in her hallway. Her quiet life had become unexpectedly public, but she didn't mind. If her curiosity and kindness had inspired others to pay attention to nature, that was a good thing. The 2 surviving hummingbirds lived in her garden for 3 years. The female raised 2 clutches of chicks herself, teaching them the same trick her mother had taught her. The male eventually moved to a neighboring territory, but visited Margaret's feeders throughout his life. She could always tell it was him by the way he perched on the feeder's left side, a habit he'd never broken. Dr. Yamamoto continued her research. expanding into questions about how animals learn and pass on knowledge. The preserved nest from Margaret's shed became one of the most studied specimens in her university's collection. Graduate students wrote their theses about it. Other researchers borrowed samples for their own studies. That one nest, created by accident in a garden shed, contributed to dozens of scientific papers. 5 years after the discovery, Dr. Yamamoto gave a TEDx talk about what she'd learned. She spoke about Margaret's shed, the impossible nest, and the lessons nature had taught them all. Her main point was simple but profound. Animals are smarter than we give them credit for. They solve problems. They adapt. They learn. And sometimes they do things that seem impossible, simply because no one ever told them it couldn't be done. Margaret attended that talk, sitting in the front row. She was 70 by then, still living in her Oregon farmhouse, still filling her bird feeders every morning. The garden shed was still there too, though she'd added a small plaque near the door that read, "Site of the Hummingbird Wasp Nest Discovery, 2023. Local schools brought students on field trips to see it." Margaret would tell them the story, showing them where the nest had hung, explaining what had made it so special. She always ended with the same message: pay attention to the world around you. You never know when you might discover something amazing. The story of the impossible nest became a reminder that nature still held secrets, that in our own backyards, in ordinary places, extraordinary things were happening. All it took was someone curious enough to notice, brave enough to investigate, and kind enough to care about what they found. And somewhere in the forests of Oregon, descendants of that original brave hummingbird were still flying, still building their nests near wasps, still using the chemical trick their ancestor had discovered. They didn't know they were famous. They didn't know they'd changed science. They were just living their lives, solving problems in the clever ways that nature had always solved problems. But humans knew, and humans remembered, and that made all the difference. Dr. Yamamoto barely slept that first night. Her mind kept replaying what she'd seen in Margaret's shed. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those tiny chicks chirping in their impossible home, surrounded by wasps that should have killed them. It went against everything she'd learned in her 20 years studying social insects. By 6 in the morning, she was already at the lab. Her team wouldn't arrive for another 2 hours, but she couldn't wait. The samples they'd collected were waiting, and each one might hold a piece of the puzzle. She started with the wasps themselves. Under the microscope, they looked completely normal. Their bodies were healthy, well-formed, typical of Anna's wasps found throughout the Pacific Northwest. But Robert had been right about the antennae. There was definitely some kind of coating on them. Wasps used their antennae for everything. They detected chemical signals from other wasps. They sensed danger. They identified food sources. The antennae were like their radar system, constantly scanning the environment for information. If something was interfering with that system, it would explain a lot. Dr. Yamamoto prepared a sample for chemical analysis. The coating was so thin it was almost invisible, but their equipment was sensitive enough to detect molecules. She loaded the sample into the gas chromatograph and waited for results. The machine would separate and identify every chemical compound present. While that test ran, she examined the bird nest materials under a different microscope. The moss was common Oregon moss, nothing unusual there. The grass was standard prairie grass. But the spider silk was interesting. Spider silk had special properties. It was incredibly strong for its weight, and it could hold other materials together better than almost any natural adhesive. The test results came back from the chromatograph. Dr. Yamamoto stared at the screen, her coffee growing cold in her hand. The coating on the wasp's antennae wasn't just one chemical. It was a complex mixture. There were plant oils, definitely from multiple sources. There were trace amounts of bird proteins. And most interesting of all, there were compounds that looked suspiciously similar to wasp pheromones but not quite identical. She needed a second opinion. She called her colleague, Dr. Richard Chen, who specialized in insect chemical communication. She emailed him the results and waited. He called back 15 minutes later. "Helen, this is remarkable," he said, and she could hear the excitement in his voice. "Those compounds, the ones that look like wasp pheromones, they're close enough that they might be fooling the wasp's chemical receptors. Explain it to me like I'm not a chemist," she said. "Okay, think of it this way. Wasps communicate through chemicals. When there's danger, they release alarm pheromones that tell other wasps to attack. When everything's calm, they release different chemicals that say everything's fine. What you're seeing here looks like someone accidentally created a calm down signal that the wasps believe. But where did it come from? That's the fascinating part. Look at the plant oils. Those aren't random. Someone, probably the mother hummingbird, selected very specific plants to build her nest. Plants that naturally produce compounds similar to wasp calming signals. And when you mix those with her own bird proteins and the spider silk, you get this perfect storm of chemicals that tells the wasps there's no threat. Dr. Yamamoto sat down heavily in her chair. So the hummingbird accidentally discovered a way to hack the wasp's communication system? It looks that way, though I wouldn't call it entirely accidental.
Hummingbirds are intelligent.
They learn. They adapt. It's possible this bird tried different materials and found a combination that worked. When her team arrived, Dr. Yamamoto shared what she'd discovered. Robert and Lisa looked at each other in amazement. So the bird essentially drugged the wasps? Lisa asked. Not drugged exactly, Dr. Yamamoto explained. More like she's speaking their language. She's telling them, through chemistry, that everything is fine. There's no threat, no reason to attack, and the wasps believe it because that's how their brains are wired to work. They spent the rest of the morning testing the theory. They collected data from the wasp nest itself, looking for the same chemical compounds. They found them everywhere, concentrated especially around where the bird nest had been attached. The mother hummingbird had essentially coated her nest in a chemical camouflage, but there was more to the story. The thermal imaging data revealed another piece of the puzzle. Dr. Yamamoto pulled up the recordings on her computer. Look at this, she said, pointing to the screen. The bird nest created a warm spot, about 5 degrees warmer than the surrounding area. From the chick's body heat? Robert asked. Exactly. Hummingbird metabolism runs incredibly hot. They need constant energy just to stay alive. That warmth they produce doesn't just help them. It helps the wasps too. She pulled up her notes on wasp behavior. Wasps are cold-blooded. When temperatures drop and fall, they start to die off or go dormant. But if there's a warm spot in the nest, they'll cluster around it. It keeps them alive longer. So the bird nest was like a heater for the wasps, Lisa said. Right. And that created a feedback loop. The wasps stayed active because of the warmth, but they stayed calm because of the chemicals. The bird got protection from predators because wasps naturally defend their nests. Everyone benefited. It was an accidental partnership born from pure chance and the mother hummingbird's clever choice of nesting materials. But it worked. Against all odds, it worked. Dr. Yamamoto spent the afternoon analyzing the location itself. Margaret's shed wasn't just any shed. It was positioned in a spot that was sheltered from wind but got morning sun. It was elevated enough to discourage ground predators. The structure was solid enough to protect from rain but had enough ventilation to prevent overheating. This is a perfect location, she told her team, for both species. The hummingbird chose wisely. But one question kept nagging at her. How did the mother bird even find this spot? How did she know the wasps wouldn't kill her? Birds weren't stupid, but this required a level of insight that seemed almost impossible. She decided to review everything they knew about Anna's hummingbirds. She spent hours reading research papers, watching videos, talking to ornithologists. What she learned was surprising. Hummingbirds were smarter than most people realized. They could remember every flower they'd visited and when it would have nectar again. They could learn from experience and adapt their behavior. Some researchers believed they could even plan ahead, which was rare in birds. What if, Dr. Yamamoto said to her empty office, what if she didn't just stumble into this? What if she observed the wasps first, watched them, learned their patterns, and then found a way to live alongside them? It seemed like a reach, but the evidence supported it. The choice of nesting materials was too specific to be random. The location was too perfect to be luck. The mother hummingbird had solved a problem that no scientist had ever considered: how to live safely in a predator's home. Patricia called late that afternoon with an update on the chicks. They're doing better than I expected, she said. Still critical, but they're eating. They're fighting. 2 of them especially are showing real strength. Margaret had called 3 times that day asking about the birds. Dr. Yamamoto promised to keep her updated. This woman's curiosity and quick thinking had made this discovery possible. She deserved to know everything they learned. By the end of the week, Dr. Yamamoto had enough data to start writing a paper. But she knew it would be controversial. Scientists would question it. They'd demand more evidence. They'd want to replicate the findings. She needed to be thorough to document everything perfectly. She also needed to answer the biggest question. Was this a one-time fluke, or was this something that could happen again? Were there other birds out there living alongside wasps? Had other researchers simply not noticed? She put out a call to naturalists and wildlife photographers across the country. Had anyone seen unusual bird nests, especially near wasp or hornet nests? The responses started coming in slowly, but they were fascinating. A photographer in California had once seen a small bird near a hornet nest and wondered about it. A naturalist in Washington had found a nest that seemed oddly close to a wasp colony. Nobody had investigated deeply, but the observations were there. Maybe this wasn't as rare as they thought. Maybe birds and insects had been experimenting with coexistence all along, and humans just hadn't been paying attention. Dr. Yamamoto worked late into the night, compiling data, writing notes, preparing her findings. This discovery would change how people thought about animal behavior. It would show that nature was more creative, more adaptable, and more surprising than anyone imagined. The preserved nest sat in its climate-controlled container, still full of slowly moving wasps. They were alive, healthy, and still behaving in ways that defied standard wasp behavior. Dr. Yamamoto watched them through the glass, these small creatures that had inadvertently become part of something remarkable. In Margaret's shed, a tiny mother hummingbird had done something that scientists thought was impossible. She'd turned enemies into neighbors. She'd used chemistry and cleverness to create a safe home for her babies. And in doing so, she'd taught humans a lesson about the hidden intelligence of the natural world. The mystery wasn't fully solved. There were still questions to answer, more tests to run, more data to collect. But Dr. Yamamoto knew they'd discovered something truly special, something that would be studied and discussed for years to come. And somewhere out there, that brave mother hummingbird was still flying, still surviving, still carrying the knowledge of what she'd accomplished. Even if she never knew that her nest had become famous, she'd proven that nature always has more tricks up its sleeve than humans can predict. The 3 hummingbird chicks were so small they could have fit in a tablespoon. Their tiny bodies trembled with each chirp, their oversized beaks opening and closing in desperate hunger. Dr. Yamamoto stared at them in complete disbelief. In all her years studying insects and their behaviors, she had never encountered anything remotely like this. She carefully adjusted her position on the ladder to get a better view. The bird nest was intricately woven, tucked perfectly into the center of the wasp nest like a secret room. Someone had built this with incredible skill and determination. The mother hummingbird had used grass, soft moss, and spider silk to create a cup-shaped home for her babies. It was beautiful work, but it was in the absolute worst possible place. Hummingbirds and wasps were natural enemies. Wasps hunted small insects, and they were fiercely protective of their territory. Any bird that dared approach a wasp nest would normally be swarmed and driven away. Some wasps would even attack birds much larger than themselves. The idea that a hummingbird, one of the smallest birds around, could enter an active wasp colony was unthinkable. The idea that she built a nest there was impossible. Yet here was the proof right in front of them. "Where's the mother?" Margaret asked from below. Dr. Yamamoto scanned the shed carefully.
"She's not here."
"She probably fled when we started making noise. Hummingbirds are easily startled." She took more photographs, making sure to document every detail. The positioning of the nests, the behavior of the wasps, the condition of the chicks. Everything would be important for understanding how this happened. The graduate student named Robert held the collection containers steady. "Dr. Yamamoto, look at the wasps. They're moving, but they're slow. Almost like they're sedated." He was right. The wasps were alive, no question about it. Their legs moved. Their antennae twitched, but they weren't aggressive. They weren't even particularly active. They clustered around the bird nest in strange patterns, almost like they were guarding it, or maybe they were confused by it. It was hard to tell. "Temperature?" Dr. Yamamoto asked. The other graduate student, Lisa, checked her instruments. "It's warmer inside the nest structure than outside. About 5 degrees warmer. The bird nest seems to be acting like a heating element." That was interesting. Very interesting. Wasps were cold-blooded creatures. When temperatures dropped, they slowed down. That's why wasp activity decreased in fall and winter. But if the bird nest was creating warmth, That might explain why these wasps hadn't died off or completely hibernated like they normally would have. Dr. Yamamoto carefully used a small brush to move some of the wasp nest material aside. She needed to see more of the structure. How deep did the bird nest go? How had the mother attached it? The more she uncovered, the more questions she had. The wasp nest was built first, she said, thinking out loud. See how the layers curve around this space? The hummingbird found this nest, somehow got inside and built her home in the center. Then the wasps continued building around her. But why didn't they attack her? Robert asked. That's the million-dollar question, Dr. Yamamoto replied. She took samples of the bird nest material, carefully placing them in labeled containers. The moss felt damp. The spider silk was incredibly strong. The grass was fresh, probably gathered within the last few weeks. This nest was new, very new. One of the wasps crawled slowly across the bird nest rim. Dr. Yamamoto watched it carefully. It moved right past one of the chirping chicks. Close enough to touch it, close enough to sting it, but it didn't. It just kept crawling like the baby bird wasn't even there. I need to collect some live specimens, she said, very carefully. Using soft forceps, she gently picked up several wasps and placed them in ventilated containers. They barely reacted. Under normal circumstances, wasps would be furious about being captured. They'd try to sting anything nearby. These wasps just accepted it, moving slowly in their containers like they were half asleep. Margaret climbed a few steps up the ladder, careful not to get too close. Can I see them? The babies? Dr. Yamamoto moved slightly to give her a better view. Margaret's eyes filled with tears again when she saw the tiny chicks. They're so small, Margaret whispered. Will they survive? I don't know, Dr. Yamamoto answered honestly. Without their mother, they need food every 15 to 20 minutes. Hummingbirds have incredibly fast metabolisms. If we can't find the mother or get them to a rehabilitation specialist soon, they won't make it. The reality of the situation was settling in. This wasn't just a scientific curiosity. These were living creatures that needed help. The mother hummingbird was gone, scared away by all the activity. She might not come back, especially with humans so close to her nest. David, who'd been watching from outside the tent, spoke up. There's a wildlife rehabilitation center about 40 minutes from here. They have someone who specializes in hummingbirds. I worked with them last year on a different case. Call them, Dr. Yamamoto said immediately. We need someone here as soon as possible. While David made the call, Dr. Yamamoto continued her examination. She used a thermal imaging camera to scan the entire nest structure. The results were fascinating. The bird nest was definitely warmer than the surrounding areas. The heat was coming from the chicks themselves, their tiny bodies working overtime to stay alive. That warmth was radiating outward, creating a pocket of comfortable temperature in the center of the wasp nest. This location, she said, it's actually perfect for both species. The shed protects them from wind and rain. It's elevated, which helps with predators. And the wasp's paper nest provides insulation. So they're helping each other? Lisa asked, without meaning to. Maybe, Dr. Yamamoto said carefully. Or maybe the hummingbird is incredibly clever and found a way to exploit the wasp's nest for her own benefit. She took air samples from inside the nest structure, careful to disturb as little as possible. There might be chemical signals in the air, pheromones, something that explained how the bird managed to coexist with the wasps. Every sample, every photograph, every measurement could hold the key to understanding this mystery. The wasps themselves were remarkable specimens. Dr. Yamamoto examined several under a magnifying glass. Their coloring was normal. Their body structure looked healthy, but something about them was different. She couldn't put her finger on it yet, but they weren't behaving like any wasp she'd studied before. Look at their antennae, Robert said, peering through his own magnifying glass. There's something on them. Some kind of coating. Dr. Yamamoto looked closer. He was right. The wasp's antennae, which they used to sense chemicals and communicate with each other, had a slight film on them. It was barely visible, but it was there. We need to analyze this, she said excitedly. This could be the answer. If something is coating their antennae, it might be interfering with their ability to detect threats. She collected samples from the wasp's antennae, using a technique so delicate it looked like she was painting with an invisible brush. Each sample went into its own container, labeled with exact information about where and when it was collected. The rehabilitation specialist, a woman named Patricia, arrived about 30 minutes later. She took one look at the chicks and immediately understood the urgency. She had brought a special carrier that could maintain the exact temperature hummingbird chicks needed. "They're dehydrated," Patricia said after a quick examination, "but they're fighters. I can see that." She carefully lifted each chick from the bird nest, supporting their fragile bodies with expert hands. Each one went into the carrier, which had soft padding and a heating element. She gave them tiny drops of sugar water using a dropper so small it looked like a toy. "I'll do everything I can," Patricia promised Margaret, "but I need to be honest. Without their mother, their chances aren't great. Hummingbirds are incredibly difficult to raise." Margaret nodded, understanding. "Just try. Please try." Patricia left with the chicks, promising to send updates every few hours. The shed suddenly felt empty without the chirping. Dr. Yamamoto stood there for a moment, looking at the now vacant bird nest. "We need to preserve everything exactly as it is," she said. "The entire structure needs to come with us to the lab." The team worked for the next 2 hours, carefully removing the entire combined nest from the rafters. They built a protective box around it, making sure nothing was disturbed. The wasps that were still alive stayed in their positions, barely reacting to being moved. Back at the university laboratory, Dr. Yamamoto and her team set up the nest in a secure room with controlled temperature and lighting. They positioned cameras to record everything 24 hours a day. The wasps were still alive, still moving slowly, still behaving in ways that defied explanation. "Tomorrow we start the real work," Dr. Yamamoto told her team. "We analyze every sample. We test every theory. Something happened here that shouldn't be possible. Our job is to figure out what." Margaret went home that evening exhausted but excited. Her ordinary wasp nest had become the center of a scientific investigation. She thought about the tiny chicks fighting for their lives at the rehabilitation center. She thought about the mother hummingbird, probably searching for her babies. She thought about all those wasps living peacefully around a nest that should have triggered their every aggressive instinct. The world was stranger than she'd ever imagined, and somehow, impossibly, it had all happened in her garden shed. The mystery was just beginning to unfold, and nobody knew yet just how remarkable the answers would turn out to be. But one thing was certain. Nothing about this made sense according to everything science knew about these creatures. Which meant that everything they thought they knew might need to be rewritten. David Torres had been in the pest control business for 15 years. He'd seen it all, or at least he thought he had. Raccoons in attics, bee swarms in walls, entire colonies of ants living under kitchen floors. Nothing surprised him anymore. When he got the call about a wasp nest with strange sounds coming from it, he figured it was probably just birds nesting nearby, and the homeowner was confused about where the sound was coming from. Happened all the time. He pulled up to Margaret's house around 9 in the morning. It was a nice property, well-maintained, with gardens that showed someone who really cared about their yard. Margaret met him at the door before he could even knock. She looked like she hadn't slept much, and there was an urgency in her eyes that caught his attention. "Thank you for coming so quickly," she said, leading him around the back of the house. "I know this probably sounds crazy, but I swear there's something inside that wasp nest that shouldn't be there." David had heard versions of this speech before. People got nervous about wasps, understandably. Sometimes they heard things that weren't there, or mistook one sound for another. He grabbed his equipment bag from the truck and followed her to the shed, ready to do a standard removal and calm her nerves. But the moment he stepped into that shed and heard the sound, everything changed. David had removed thousands of wasp nests. He knew what they sounded like. He knew the angry buzz of disturbed wasps, the quieter hum of a calm colony, even the papery rustle when wind hit an abandoned nest. This was none of those things. This was definitely chirping, bird chirping, and it was coming from inside the nest. He set down his bag slowly, his mind trying to process what he was hearing. Margaret stood in the doorway watching his reaction. "You hear it too, right?" she asked. "I'm not crazy." "You're not crazy," David said quietly. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it up at the nest. From this angle, he could see the entrance hole the wasps used. He watched for several minutes. No movement, no wasps flying in or out. The chirping continued. He'd learned long ago that when something didn't make sense, you documented everything before you touched anything. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures from every angle. Close-ups of the nest structure, wide shots showing its position on the rafters. Video footage with sound. He recorded everything, "Have you seen any wasp activity?" he asked Margaret. "Not for about 2 weeks," she replied. "Before that, there were definitely wasps. I saw them flying around. But then it got cold and they just stopped." David nodded, still staring at the nest. His professional instinct told him to just remove it. That was his job. But something bigger was happening here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't something he should handle alone. "Mrs. Chen," he said, "I think we need to call someone else before we do anything with this nest. Someone who studies insects and birds." "A scientist," Margaret looked relieved. "I was hoping you'd say that. I didn't want to sound ridiculous, but this seems important." David made a call to a contact he'd worked with before, a professor at Oregon State University who specialized in insects. He explained the situation, expecting some skepticism. Instead, the professor gave him the direct number for Dr. Helen Yamamoto, an entomologist who studied social insects like wasps and bees. When David called and described what they were hearing, Dr. Yamamoto didn't laugh or dismiss him. Instead, she asked him to send the video footage immediately. He did. She called back 5 minutes later. "Don't touch that nest," she said firmly. "I'm coming there right now. I'm bringing a team. Give me 3 hours." Those 3 hours felt like an eternity. David stayed at the property, keeping watch over the shed like it contained treasure. Margaret brought him coffee and they sat on her back porch, occasionally walking back to the shed to listen to the ongoing chirping. "In all your years doing this," Margaret asked, "have you ever seen anything like this?" David shook his head. "Never. Wasps are territorial. They attack anything that gets near their nest. Birds, other insects, people. The idea that something could be living inside their nest, actually inside it, and not be torn apart, it shouldn't be possible." "But you hear it," Margaret said. "We both hear it. I hear it," David confirmed. "And I can't explain it." Dr. Yamamoto arrived with 2 graduate students and enough equipment to fill the back of a van. She was younger than David expected, maybe late 30s with sharp eyes that took in everything. She introduced herself quickly and went straight to the shed. She stood there for 10 minutes just listening. Then she set up recording equipment. Then she brought in specialized cameras. She measured the temperature inside the shed. She collected air samples. She photographed everything David had already photographed, but with better equipment. "This is remarkable," she finally said, more to herself than anyone else. "This shouldn't be happening." "What do you think is in there?" Margaret asked. Dr. Yamamoto turned to face them both. "Based on the sound, I believe there are baby birds inside that nest. The frequency and pattern suggest hatchlings, probably less than 2 weeks old. But that raises 2 impossible questions. First, how did an adult bird enter an active wasp colony to build a nest? Second, why didn't the wasps kill it?" She pulled out more equipment from her van. "We need to approach this carefully. If there are living chicks in there, they're fragile. If there are still wasps in there, they could become aggressive. And if we're witnessing some kind of unprecedented behavior, we need to document every second of it." The team set up a containment tent around the shed. They erected cameras at multiple angles. They prepared collection containers, medical supplies, and protective gear. What should have been a simple nest removal turned into a full scientific operation. David watched in amazement as Dr. Yamamoto coordinated her team with military precision. They moved efficiently but carefully, preparing for every possible scenario. Margaret stayed close, asking questions and offering help wherever she could. "We're going to open the nest in stages," Dr. Yamamoto explained, "layer by layer. The outer shell first, then we'll see what's underneath. Everyone needs to be ready for anything." She suited up in protective gear, including thick gloves and a veil. One of her students held a camera. The other stood ready with collection equipment. David and Margaret watched from a safe distance outside the tent. Dr. Yamamoto climbed a ladder and positioned herself next to the nest. She had a small knife specially designed for delicate dissection work. She placed it against the outer layer of the nest and began to cut slowly and carefully. The papery outer shell came away easily. Underneath was another layer and another. The nest was built like an onion, layer upon layer of paper that the wasps had constructed. As each layer came away, the chirping got louder. Whatever was inside knew something was happening. Then Dr. Yamamoto stopped. She leaned in closer, her light shining on something that made her freeze. "Oh my God," she whispered. "What is it?" Margaret called out. "What do you see?" Dr. Yamamoto carefully backed down the ladder, her face pale with shock. She looked at her students, then at David and Margaret. "There's another nest inside the wasp nest," she said slowly. "A bird nest, built from grass and moss and spider webs. And I can see movement. There are definitely chicks in there." "How is that possible?" David asked. "I don't know," Dr. Yamamoto admitted. "But we're about to find out." She climbed back up the ladder, this time with her students positioned to catch anything that might fall. The cameras were rolling. Everyone held their breath. This was the moment they'd all been waiting for. Dr. Yamamoto continued her careful dissection of the wasp nest. She removed another layer, then another. The structure was more complex than any wasp nest she'd ever seen. It was as if the wasps had built around something, accommodating it rather than destroying it. Finally, she reached the inner chamber. She shone her light inside and everyone could see what was making the noise. 3 tiny birds, their eyes still closed, their bodies covered in the faintest layer of down feathers. They were chirping constantly, their beaks open wide, expecting food that wasn't coming. "They're hummingbirds," Dr. Yamamoto said, her voice full of wonder. "Anna's hummingbirds. They can't be more than a week old." But that wasn't the most shocking part. As she carefully removed more of the wasp nest material, everyone could see the wasps. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, clustered around the bird nest. They weren't dead. They were moving, slowly, lethargically. They were alive, living in the same space as birds that should have been their enemies. "This is impossible," one of the graduate students whispered. Dr. Yamamoto carefully took samples of everything, pieces of both nests, individual wasps, even air samples from inside the structure. She photographed every angle, every detail. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear but from excitement. "In 20 years of studying insects," she said, "I have never seen anything like this. This defies everything we know about wasp behavior. Everything we know about predator-prey relationships. This shouldn't exist, but here it is, right in front of us." Margaret watched from outside the tent, tears in her eyes. She didn't understand all the science, but she understood that something incredible had happened in her shed, something that no one had ever seen before. "What happens now?" she asked. Dr. Yamamoto looked at her seriously. "Now we figure out how this happened, and that might change everything we thought we knew about these creatures." Margaret Chen had lived in her small Oregon farmhouse for almost 30 years. At 62, she knew every corner of her property like the back of her hand. The old garden shed behind her house had been there longer than she had, its wooden walls weathered gray by countless rainy seasons. She used it to store her gardening tools, some old paint cans, and boxes of things she couldn't quite bring herself to throw away. It was early October when she first noticed the nest. She'd gone to the shed to grab her rake, and there it was, hanging from the rafters like a giant paper lantern. At first glance, it looked completely ordinary, just a wasp nest. She'd seen plenty of them over the years. This one was about the size of a football, maybe a bit bigger, with that familiar grayish color and those distinctive layers that looked almost like papier-mâché. Margaret wasn't particularly afraid of wasps, but she wasn't foolish either. She'd been stung enough times in her life to know better than to mess with them. Her plan was simple. Wait for the weather to get colder, let the wasps calm down or die off, then call someone to remove it. No rush, no drama, just patience. The October weather in Oregon can be unpredictable, but that year it turned cold fast. The temperatures dropped earlier than usual, and Margaret figured the wasps were probably done for the season. She'd noticed less activity around the shed. No buzzing, no wasps flying in and out. It seemed safe enough to go in and out for her tools as long as she didn't disturb the nest itself. 3 weeks passed. Margaret went about her normal routine. She'd water her flower beds in the morning, tend to her vegetable garden in the afternoon, and sometimes she'd sit on her back porch with a cup of tea watching the birds. She loved birds. Always had. She kept 2 feeders hanging from her porch and made sure they were always full. Hummingbirds were her favorite, though they were starting to migrate south for the winter. One particular morning, the sun was just starting to warm things up after a chilly night. Margaret needed her hand trowel to plant some bulbs before the ground got too hard. She walked to the shed, pulled open the creaky door, and stepped inside. The familiar smell of old wood and dirt filled her nose. She was reaching for her tool basket when she heard it. A sound, coming from above. She froze, her hand still outstretched. It wasn't the angry buzzing she expected from a disturbed wasp nest. This was different, softer, almost musical. It sounded like tiny chirping. Birds in her shed. She looked up slowly at the nest hanging from the rafters. The sound was definitely coming from inside the nest. Margaret's heart started beating faster. This didn't make sense. Wasps don't chirp. Birds don't live in wasp nests. She stood there for a solid minute, just listening. The chirping continued, faint but steady. It had a rhythm to it, like baby birds calling for their mother. She backed out of the shed carefully, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening up there. Once outside, she stood in her yard staring at the shed door. Her mind was racing. What could possibly be inside that nest? Was she imagining things? No, she definitely heard chirping, clear as day. Margaret wasn't the type to panic, but she was curious. Very curious. She went back into her house and grabbed her phone. If there was something unusual going on, she wanted a record of it. Maybe she was wrong about the sound. Maybe her ears were playing tricks on her. But she had to know. She opened the shed door again, this time with her phone's camera recording. She pointed it up at the nest and zoomed in as much as she could. The nest looked completely normal from the outside. Same papery texture, same gray color, same hexagonal patterns she'd seen on wasp nests before. But that sound was still there. Margaret recorded about 2 minutes of footage, making sure to capture the audio. When she played it back, there it was. Clear chirping sounds. She wasn't imagining it. Something was definitely alive inside that nest, and it wasn't wasps. She called her neighbor, Betty, who lived about half a mile down the road. Betty had lived in Oregon her whole life and knew everything about local wildlife. If anyone could explain this, it would be her. Betty arrived within 20 minutes, curious and skeptical in equal measure. Margaret led her to the shed, and they both stood there, listening. Betty's eyes went wide when she heard the chirping. "That's not wasps," Betty said quietly. "That's birds. Baby birds, by the sound of it. But how?" Margaret asked. "How could birds be inside a wasp nest?" Betty shook her head slowly. "I have no idea. In all my years, I've never heard of such a thing. Wasps would attack anything that got near their nest, let alone something building inside it." They both stared up at the mysterious nest, neither quite sure what to do next. Betty suggested calling animal control, or maybe a pest control company. Someone who dealt with this kind of thing professionally, Margaret agreed. This was beyond her expertise. That afternoon, Margaret made several phone calls. She explained the situation as best she could, though she could tell some people thought she was confused or mistaken. Birds inside a wasp nest? Impossible. But she had the video evidence. She had the audio. Something extraordinary was happening in her shed, and she needed someone who would take it seriously. The local pest control company said they'd send someone out the next morning. Margaret spent the rest of the day unable to think about anything else. She kept walking out to the shed, listening. The chirping continued throughout the day. Whatever was in there, it was alive and seemingly healthy.